All right, let's jump right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are tackling a truly fascinating and, honestly, highly debated subject. We're looking at a historical framework presented by researcher Walter Williams, specifically his work titled How Europe Created and Destroyed World History. Now, Williams makes some incredibly radical historical claims here. He argues that European powers effectively engaged in historicide, basically manufacturing a totally fabricated Greco-Roman heritage while completely erasing the African foundations of world history. Today, we're taking a strictly data-driven, impartial approach to this. We're going to put his specific claims right up against the latest empirical evidence from archaeology, genomics, and classical studies to see exactly where the data aligns with his narrative and where it fundamentally completely diverges.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. 1. The Radical Williams Thesis. 2. Greco-Roman Literacy Examined. 3. Genetics of Ancient Egypt. 4. The Stolen Legacy Investigated. And 5. Reclaiming History with Truth.
Section 1. The Radical Williams Thesis, examining the claims and the context of historicide.
So, Williams posits that history, as an academic discipline, was essentially fabricated by European institutions during the Renaissance specifically to establish global dominance. And the sheer scale of his assertions is just staggering. I mean, he isn't just tweaking a few historical dates. He is proposing a total revisionist framework. He claims that biblical figures are purely allegorical, and get this, that ancient Greek giants like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle never even existed. He argues that ancient Egyptians were literally the only literate people on Earth during antiquity. He even dismisses the entire Sumerian civilization in Mesopotamia as a faked myth, complete with planted artifacts, and claims a Germanic tribe known as the Lombards created paper money in the 13th century just to establish a one-world order over global finance.
Now, before we test those specific claims, we really need to acknowledge the legitimate historical grievance that's driving this narrative. This quote kind of captures the essence of what scholars often call epistemicide, which is the very real colonial hoarding, misrepresentation, and absolute erasure of African history by European powers. For centuries, Eurocentric education often minimized African and Asian achievements. Williams is responding to a real historical injustice here, a will to ignorance that characterized a lot of 19th century colonial history. But the real question we have to ask today is, does the evidence actually support his specific alternative model?
Moving on to Section 2, Greco-Roman Literacy Examined, the Evolution of Mediterranean Scripts. Let's put our first major empirical test to one of Williams' boldest claims, the idea that Greeks and Romans were illiterate savages who had zero alphabet or institutions to record their own history. Williams explicitly claims that Greeks had no alphabet before Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, arguing the Greek language was essentially forced upon literate African Egyptians. But when we look at the epigraphic and archaeological reality, it tells a completely different story. The Greek alphabet was actually a highly sophisticated adaptation of Semitic scripts, like Phoenician and Aramaic, and it was developed way earlier, between 800 and 750 BCE.
To put that into perspective, let's just follow this timeline chronologically. This wasn't some sudden fabrication, it was the evolution of a shared Mediterranean technology. Around 1000 BCE, we see the Phoenician abjad spreading through trade. By 800 to 750 BCE, archaic Greece introduces vowels to make it phonetically consistent. By 650 to 550 BCE, we have archaic Latin. In fact, the Lapis Niger inscription in Rome dates to before 550 BCE. And by 403 BCE, the Ionian alphabet became the official standard in Athens. We have thousands of surviving artifacts, from inscribed laws to stamped pottery, proving that writing in the Mediterranean basin was real, widespread, and evolving for literally centuries before Alexander even arrived in 332 BCE.
Williams also claims they lacked institutions. So let's look at the archival evidence to humanize this data a bit. Meet Pythias. He was a village scribe in Roman Egypt. Now, ironically, Pythias himself was known as a slow writer. He was basically a bureaucrat who had to hire a professional scribe to do his actual writing for him. But the very fact that his office even existed, that even rural villages had deep, complex administrative bureaucracy that required written records, shows that the Greco-Roman world functioned through immense institutional memory. Sure, overall literacy rates might have only been around 10 to 15%, but society was still cohesively bound by the written word.
Okay, so having looked at the texts and the institutions, we have to ask our next major question. As we pivot from epigraphy to biology, does the genetic data actually support the idea of a completely racially isolated, monolithic ancient world, like extreme Afrocentric and Eurocentric models often claim?
Which brings us to Section 3, Genetics of Ancient Egypt, the Genomic Profile of the Nile Valley.
Williams strongly asserts that ancient Egypt was a singular, racially homogeneous black civilization that was later completely whitewashed. To test this, scientists looked at the first complete genome of an Old Kingdom Egyptian male. He's known as NUE001, and he lived around 4,500 years ago, right during the age of the pyramids. His DNA reveals a really complex admixture. Roughly 80% of his ancestry comes from deep indigenous North African Neolithic roots, while 20% stems from the Eastern Fertile Crescent, which is modern-day Mesopotamia. This directly supports the archaeological evidence that Egypt from its very inception was an interconnected bridge between Africa and West Asia. It was never a biologically isolated population.
Now, get this. Here is a truly incredible statistic: 8%. When scientists look at the longitudinal genetic record, comparing ancient mummies from sites like Abu Sir el-Melek to modern populations, the sub-Saharan African genetic component actually increased by roughly 8% in the post-antiquity period. Ancient Egyptians had stronger affinities with Near Eastern populations than modern Egyptians do today. So what does this mean? It means the idea that ancient Egypt was purely sub-Saharan African and was later replaced by lighter-skinned conquerors runs completely backwards to what the genetic timeline actually shows.
Section 4. The Stolen Legacy Investigated. Unpacking the Myth of the Egyptian Mystery System. Another massive pillar of Williams' argument is that Greek philosophy, mathematics, and science were literally stolen from a secret Black Egyptian mystery system. But classicists like Mary Lefkowitz have meticulously dismantled this. When you actually trace the historical origin of this supposed ancient Egyptian system, well, you don't find it in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs or the Book of the Dead. You actually find it in an 18th century French fictional novel called Sethos, written by Abbé Jean Terrasson in 1731. Because genuine Egyptian texts hadn't been deciphered yet, Terrasson just imagined an elaborate initiation cult. This fictional cult was later adopted by European Freemasons, and ironically enough, those Masonic traditions were later embraced by 20th century Afrocentric writers as actual ancient African history.
Furthermore, the timeline simply doesn't hold up. A really common claim in this stolen legacy narrative is that Aristotle stole his philosophical works from the Great Library of Alexandria in Egypt. But there is a glaring chronological impossibility right there. The Library of Alexandria wasn't founded until after Aristotle's death. You literally cannot steal from a library that hasn't been built yet. When we prioritize politically driven narratives over strict historical timelines, the integrity of the data just falls apart.
We see a similar kind of oversimplification with the Moors. Williams frequently refers to the Moors in Spain as this monolithic black African empire that civilized a Dark Age Europe. But the demographic reality of Al-Andalus paints a much more complicated picture. Moor was really just a European catch-all term for a Muslim population that was incredibly diverse. It included the Arab political elite from the Arabian Peninsula, Berbers from North Africa who made up the primary military force, Muwallads who were native Iberian converts to Islam, right alongside sub-Saharan Africans acting as soldiers and laborers. It was this cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic Islamic civilization spanning 3 entire continents, not a singular racial empire.
And finally, Section 5. Reclaiming History with Truth. The balance of intellectual integrity and historical justice.
So how do we balance the very real need to decolonize our archives with intellectual integrity? Historian Clarence E. Walker provides a pretty sharp critique of frameworks exactly like Williams. He argues that substituting pseudo-history for the real thing is ultimately damaging. He states what they have produced is a therapeutic mythology designed to restore the self-esteem of Black Americans by creating a past that never was. For Walker, and many mainstream scholars, true empowerment comes from grappling with the complex, hybrid reality of real history, rather than retreating into fabricated historical fantasies.
Walker asks this famously grounded question that I think we should all keep in mind. If everybody was a king, who built the pyramids? When we rely on these essentialist models, whether they're extreme Eurocentric models trying to whitewash history or extreme Afrocentric models claiming all ancient brilliance for a single modern racial category, we lose sight of the everyday humans. We forget the laborers, the slow-writing scribes like Paetus, the regular folks who actually built these civilizations from the ground up.
So what you should really take away from this explainer is that the ancient Mediterranean was incredibly dynamic. History was not simply created in some Renaissance vacuum by Europe at the expense of Africa. It was the collective, sprawling production of a deeply interconnected ancient world. Ideas, alphabets, and genetics constantly flowed across borders, bridging Africa, West Asia, and Europe in ways that completely defy our modern racial and geographic boundaries.
The legacy of colonial history is absolutely something we must confront and correct, but as we've seen today, doing so by discarding genetic evidence and archaeology only replaces one myth with another. I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. How can we decolonize our historical archives while still holding on to the rigorous standards of empirical evidence that actually let the past speak for its truly complex self? Think about that for a bit. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and remember to always keep questioning the history you're told.